March 28, 2024, Vatican City. Bishop Marco Santelli walked into Cardinal Toretti's office carrying a leather briefcase that would either topple a pope or destroy a bishop. "Your Eminence," Santelli said, placing the case on the mahogany desk. "Pope Francis has 72 hours. Inside that briefcase were photographs, financial records, and testimony from 47 victims. Evidence that would shatter the Catholic Church if it reached the media. Evidence that Santelli claimed would disappear forever if Pope Francis announced his resignation by Easter Sunday. What Cardinal Toretti did in the next 10 minutes would determine the fate of 1.3 billion Catholics worldwide. The Vatican's most trusted advisor faced an impossible choice: betray the Pope he loved like a father, or watch the Church burn in scandal. That Thursday before Easter, in a room where kings once knelt before God, the day the Vatican's most loyal son discovered that loyalty and truth don't always walk the same path. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Cardinal Alessandro Toretti's hands trembled as he stared at the briefcase. The afternoon light streaming through the tall windows cast long shadows across his office, making the leather case appear almost black against the polished wood. 72 hours, he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. Bishop Santelli adjusted his red zucchetto and smiled, the practiced smile of a man who'd spent years climbing the Vatican hierarchy. "I know this is difficult, Your Eminence, but the Church needs new leadership. Strong leadership." Toretti's mind raced back 30 years to another Thursday, another briefcase, another impossible choice. His mentor, Father Giuseppe Martelli, had sat in this very chair, weeping as he confessed his intention to expose everything. 3 days later, Giuseppe was dead, hanging from a rope in his quarters, leaving behind only a sealed letter that Toretti had never opened. "The Holy Father is strong," Toretti said, standing slowly. At 64, his joints protested the sudden movement, but his voice remained steady. "He has weathered many storms. Not like this one." Santelli clicked open the briefcase. The manila folders inside were meticulously organized, each tab bearing a date, a name, a location. 47 victims across 6 decades, payments totaling 38 million euros, transfer orders bearing your signature, Your Eminence. The blood drained from Toretti's face, his signature, the payments he'd authorized to protect the Church's reputation. Money that had silenced families, buried investigations, relocated predators to new parishes. Each transaction had felt like a small death, but he'd told himself it was necessary. The greater good. "These people trusted the Church," Santelli continued, removing a photograph. A young boy's school portrait, his smile innocent and bright. "They trusted us to protect their children." "You think I don't know that?" Toretti's composure cracked. "You think I sleep peacefully? Every decision I've made has been to preserve the faith that sustains 1 billion souls. And yet the abuse continued." Santelli's voice hardened. "Because men like you chose silence over justice, reputation over truth." Through the windows, Toretti could see pilgrims gathering in St. Peter's Square for the evening mass, families with children, elderly couples clutching rosaries, young priests from distant parishes, all of them trusting that the men in these sacred halls served God above all else. "What do you want?" Toretti asked. "Pope Francis announces his resignation tomorrow. Health concerns, age, the usual euphemisms. A new conclave elects fresh leadership, someone who understands that some secrets are too dangerous for exposure. And if I refuse to advise him to step down?" Santelli gestured to the briefcase. "By Monday morning, every major news outlet receives copies. The Vatican bank records showing systematic cover-ups, the settlement agreements, the transfer orders with your signature authorizing payments to silence victims' families." Toretti walked to the window, his reflection ghostly in the glass. Below, Swiss guards in their ceremonial uniforms maintained their eternal vigil. Behind him, the weight of centuries pressed down through Renaissance frescoes and priceless artifacts. This office had been his sanctuary for 8 years, the place where he'd served as Pope Francis's most trusted advisor. his confessor, his friend. The Holy Father has brought transparency to this church, Toretti said. He's implemented reforms, removed corrupt officials. Too little, too late. Santelli closed the briefcase with a sharp click. And you know it. The Francis papacy is wounded, Your Eminence. These revelations would be fatal. Better a controlled transition than complete collapse. Toretti turned back to face the younger man. Bishop Santelli was ambitious, brilliant, and utterly ruthless, everything the church claimed to oppose yet consistently rewarded. His rise through the ranks had been meteoric, his supporters wealthy and influential. You're asking me to betray the Holy Father. I'm asking you to save the church. Santelli stood, smoothing his cassock. You have 47 victims who deserve justice, Your Eminence. Their stories will be told, one way or another. The only question is whether the church survives the telling. The briefcase remained on the desk like a malignant growth. Inside those folders lay the accumulated sins of decades, decisions made in oak-paneled rooms by men who believed good intentions justified terrible choices. Men like himself. 72 hours, Santelli repeated, moving toward the door. I'll need your answer by Saturday evening. The Holy Father's resignation announcement Sunday morning, before Easter Mass. The door closed with a whisper, leaving Toretti alone with the briefcase and 30 years of buried guilt. The setting sun painted the office walls crimson, and for a moment he could almost see Giuseppe's ghost in the shadows, holding that final letter, the letter that still waited, unopened, in Toretti's private safe, the letter that might contain the key to everything, or destroy what little remained of his soul. But before we reveal what secrets that letter holds, what decisions Cardinal Toretti will make, and how Pope Francis responds to the greatest threat of his papacy, let me know in the comments which character has captured your attention so far. And if you're invested in discovering whether truth or loyalty wins this deadly game, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow's chapter reveals a shocking conversation between Toretti and Pope Francis that changes everything. Introduction. The silence that followed Santelli's departure felt alive, pressing against Toretti's eardrums like the weight of confessional secrets. He remained motionless at the window, watching pilgrims stream across the cobblestones below, their voices a distant murmur of prayer and anticipation. Holy Week always brought them in greater numbers, seeking blessing, forgiveness, hope. What would they think if they knew what discussions transpired in these hallowed chambers? Toretti's fingers traced the condensation his breath had left on the ancient glass. 30 years ago, he'd stood at this same window as Giuseppe's assistant, watching his mentor wrestle with impossible choices. He'd been young then, 34, and burning with righteous ambition, convinced that faith could overcome any obstacle. Giuseppe had seemed so strong, so certain of God's will, until those final weeks when something had broken inside the older priest, some terrible knowledge that bent his spirit until it snapped. The briefcase seemed to pulse with malevolent energy behind him. Toretti could feel its presence without turning, the way one senses a predator in the darkness. Those 47 names represented more than statistics or financial liability. They were children who'd lost their innocence in sacred spaces, families who'd trusted shepherds that became wolves. Each settlement he'd authorized had been a small crucifixion, necessary, he'd told himself, to prevent greater catastrophe, but necessary for whom? A soft knock interrupted his brooding. "Come," he called, straightening his cassock. Sister Maria Benedetta entered carrying a silver tray. Steam rose from the espresso cup beside a plate of biscotti his housekeeper insisted he eat. "Your dinner, Your Eminence. You missed the evening meal again." At 73, Sister Maria had served in Vatican households for 5 decades. Her weathered hands had prepared countless meals for cardinals, bishops, even popes. She'd been Giuseppe's housekeeper before becoming his, and sometimes Toretti wondered what secrets lay behind her knowing eyes. "Grazie, sister." He moved to his desk, carefully avoiding the briefcase. "You've cared for me too well these years." She set the tray down with practiced precision, her gaze flickering briefly to the leather case. "Difficult meetings leave their marks, Your Eminence. Perhaps prayer before rest tonight?" "Perhaps." He lifted the tiny cup, inhaling the rich aroma. Coffee had been one of life's reliable consolations, the bitter warmth grounding him when ecclesiastical politics threatened to consume his soul. "Sister, Do you ever think about Father Giuseppe? Her hand stilled on the tray. Often, Your Eminence. He was a good man facing impossible burdens. What kind of burdens? She studied his face with the penetrating gaze of someone who'd witnessed too many confessions of powerful men, the kind that break hearts before they break spirits. He spoke of you often in those final days, said you were the son he'd never had. Toretti's throat constricted. Giuseppe had indeed been like a father, teaching him diplomacy, theology, the delicate art of shepherding souls while navigating Vatican intrigue. The older priest had shaped every aspect of his ecclesiastical career, molding him into the perfect Vatican insider. But what if those lessons had been built on lies? Did he ever mention a letter? Sister Maria's expression grew guarded. Many letters crossed Father Giuseppe's desk. Your Eminence. A personal letter. Something he meant for me. She was quiet for a long moment, arranging the biscotti with unnecessary precision. Some secrets are meant to stay buried, Your Eminence. Father Giuseppe understood that. After she left, Toretti sat alone with his coffee and the weight of 30 years. Through the walls he could hear the distant sounds of evening prayers from the Sistine Chapel, where generations of cardinals had elected popes and shaped the course of faith itself. Tomorrow night he would need to face Pope Francis with either a warning or a betrayal. He wasn't certain which. The apartment felt cavernous around him, filled with artifacts from a lifetime of service. Photographs showed him with world leaders, blessing children in distant parishes, celebrating Mass in soaring cathedrals. But his eyes fixed on one image tucked discreetly behind others, himself and Giuseppe at Toretti's ordination 35 years ago. Both men were smiling, hands clasped, surrounded by proud family members who died in the intervening decades. He had no family left now except the church itself. And what had that devotion cost? What compromises had he made in service to something greater than himself? Each payment to silence victims, each transfer order relocating problematic priests, each decision to prioritize institutional reputation over individual justice, all justified by the greater good. But whose definition of good? The briefcase seemed to whisper accusations in the gathering darkness. Somewhere in Vatican City's secret archives, Giuseppe's final letter waited in a locked safe, holding truths that might illuminate everything or destroy what little peace he'd managed to find. Toretti reached for the lamp, banishing shadows from corners where guilt liked to gather. Tomorrow would bring impossible choices, but tonight offered one final opportunity to sit with familiar ghosts and contemplate whether salvation required confession or silence. The coffee had grown cold, but he drank it anyway, savoring the bitterness. The darkness pressed closer despite the lamp's warm glow, and Toretti found himself thinking of Giuseppe's hands, how they'd trembled those final weeks, spilling wine during consecration, struggling to sign documents. At the time, he'd attributed it to age, stress, the ordinary burdens of high ecclesiastical office. But what if Giuseppe's tremor had been fear? Toretti set down his cold coffee and walked to the antique secretary desk in the corner of his study. Behind volumes of canon law and papal encyclicals, his fingers found the small brass key he'd hidden 30 years ago. The weight of it felt disproportionate to its size, heavy with possibility and dread. The Vatican's secret archives weren't the only repository of dangerous truths. Each Secretary of State maintained a private safe for the most sensitive documents, confessions of world leaders, diplomatic correspondence that could topple governments, financial records that traced the church's wealth through centuries of empire and scandal. Giuseppe's personal papers had passed to Toretti along with the office, including one sealed envelope marked with his own name in Giuseppe's careful script. 30 years. 3 decades of allowing that letter to gather dust rather than confront whatever truth had driven his mentor to death. The safe was hidden behind a Renaissance painting of Saint Sebastian, the martyr pierced by arrows yet gazing heavenward with serene acceptance. How often had Giuseppe stared at that image while contemplating his own sacrifice? Toretti input the combination, Giuseppe's ordination date, and the mechanism clicked open with mechanical precision. The envelope lay exactly where he'd placed it in 1994, yellowed now but sealed with red wax bearing Giuseppe's personal ring. His name was written across the front in that familiar handwriting that had shaped his theological education. guided his rise through Vatican ranks, molded him into the perfect ecclesiastical diplomat. Alessandro, the inscription read, "When you are ready for truth." His hands shook as he held the envelope to the lamplight. The paper was thin enough that shadows of text showed through, but the words remained indecipherable. Whatever Giuseppe had written in those final days remained locked away, waiting for courage or desperation to break the seal. The phone rang. Torretti startled, nearly dropping the letter. The sound cut through the apartment's silence like a blade, sharp and insistent. He glanced at the clock, 11:47 p.m. Only emergencies merited such late calls. Torretti. "Your Eminence." The voice was crisp, professional, one of the Swiss Guard night supervisors. "Forgive the intrusion, but we have a situation requiring your attention." "What kind of situation?" "Sister Maria Benedetta has been found dead in her quarters. Natural causes, it appears, but she was discovered with a document bearing your name. Captain Richter thought you should be informed immediately." The letter slipped from Torretti's nerveless fingers, fluttering to the carpet like a wounded bird. Sister Maria, who had served Giuseppe, who had known about the letter, who had warned him that some secrets should stay buried, was dead. "I'll come immediately." He hung up and stared at Giuseppe's letter lying on the floor. Coincidence was a luxury the Vatican rarely afforded. Sister Maria had tended Giuseppe through his final weeks, had been present when the older priest descended into whatever private hell had claimed his life. And now, hours after Santelli's ultimatum, hours after Torretti had asked about Giuseppe's letter, she was gone. The walk through Vatican City's moonlit corridors felt like a procession to judgment. Swiss guards nodded respectfully as he passed, their halberds glinting in the artificial light, but their eyes held questions. Word traveled quickly within these walls. Sister Maria's death would be common knowledge by morning, another thread in the web of whispers that sustained Vatican politics. Her quarters were modest, as befitted a woman who'd taken vows of poverty 50 years earlier. Captain Richter, tall and unsmiling, met Torretti at the door. "Natural causes, Your Eminence. Heart failure, likely in her sleep." But this was clutched in her hand. The document was modern paper, not Giuseppe's aged envelope. Torretti's name was written across the top in Sister Maria's careful script, below which a single sentence made his blood freeze. Father Giuseppe did not write that letter. Beneath the words, Sister Maria had drawn a small cross, the kind of blessing she'd made over countless meals, countless prayers, countless secrets whispered in confession. Torretti's world tilted on its axis. The letter waiting in his apartment, the envelope he'd preserved for 30 years believing it contained Giuseppe's final truth. If Sister Maria was right, if Giuseppe hadn't written it, then who had? And why had they wanted Torretti to believe his beloved mentor had left him a message from beyond the grave? The implications crashed over him like a tide. Someone had wanted him to find that letter, had been waiting 3 decades for him to break that seal. But why now? Why, when Santelli's ultimatum demanded impossible choices and 47 victims' names lay spread across his desk like accusations? Standing in Sister Maria's simple room, surrounded by the detritus of a life spent in service, Torretti realized his old world was ending. Whatever game had begun 30 years ago with Giuseppe's death was finally reaching its conclusion, and he was still just a pawn. Early development. The walk back to his apartment felt endless, each footstep echoing against stone corridors that had witnessed centuries of secrets. Torretti clutched Sister Maria's note in his trembling hand, the paper damp with perspiration despite the cool night air. Father Giuseppe did not write that letter. The words burned in his mind like a brand, transforming 30 years of carefully constructed reality into something unrecognizable. He tried to rationalize it away. Sister Maria had been 73, possibly confused in her final moments. Perhaps she'd mixed up correspondence, conflated different letters from different times. The dying mind played cruel tricks, invented conspiracies where none existed. Yes, that had to be it. The frightened imaginings of an elderly woman facing her final hour. But even as he constructed these mental defenses, they crumbled under the weight of accumulated doubt. Sister Maria's handwriting had been steady, her message clear and deliberate. She'd drawn that small cross with the same precision she'd used to bless meals for 50 years. This wasn't confusion. It was a final act of conscience. Back in his apartment, Giuseppe's letter lay where it had fallen, the yellowed envelope seeming to mock his decades of reverence. Torretti circled it like a dangerous animal, afraid to touch what he'd once considered sacred. If Giuseppe hadn't written it, who had? And why create such an elaborate deception? The possibilities multiplied in his mind, each more disturbing than the last. Someone had wanted him to have that letter, had orchestrated Giuseppe's death to ensure its delivery. But the timing made no sense. 30 years of patience for what purpose? Unless they'd been waiting for exactly this moment. For Santelli's ultimatum, for the perfect storm of scandal and pressure that would drive Torretti to seek answers in Giuseppe's final words. Someone had anticipated this crisis, had planted a seed 3 decades ago that would bloom precisely when needed. His phone buzzed. A text message from an unknown number. Some letters should remain unopened, especially when their authors are still alive. Torretti's blood turned to ice. Giuseppe was dead. He'd attended the funeral, delivered the eulogy, watched the casket disappear into Vatican crypts. But if the letter was a forgery, if someone had orchestrated Giuseppe's apparent suicide. Another buzz. The Sistine Chapel. Midnight. Come alone. The chapel stood empty except for shadows cast by emergency lighting, Michelangelo's masterpiece reduced to ghostly outlines in the darkness. Torretti entered through the sacristy, his footsteps muffled by centuries of prayer. The silence felt oppressive, pregnant with expectation. Alessandro. He spun toward the voice, heart hammering against his ribs. A figure emerged from behind the altar, tall, thin, wearing simple black clothing that could belong to any priest. But the face that stepped into the light made Torretti's world shatter completely. Giuseppe Martinelli stood before him, 30 years older but unmistakably alive. "Hello, my son." Torretti's legs buckled. He gripped the nearest pew to keep from falling, his mind refusing to process what his eyes confirmed. Giuseppe's hair had gone white, deep lines carved his face, but the gentle eyes remained unchanged. The same eyes that had guided his theological education, shaped his understanding of faith and duty. "Impossible," Torretti whispered. "You're dead. I saw your body. You saw what we needed you to see." Giuseppe stepped closer, his voice carrying the same paternal warmth that had once provided such comfort. "The church required my death, Alessandro. There were complications that made continued existence problematic." "Complications?" Giuseppe's expression grew pained. "I discovered things, financial irregularities that reached the highest levels, abuse networks that implicated men we'd trusted for decades. When I threatened to expose the truth, certain parties suggested alternative arrangements. The chapel spun around Torretti's vision. They made you disappear. They offered a choice, death or exile. I chose exile, conditional on maintaining the fiction of suicide. It seemed the lesser evil at the time." Giuseppe's voice cracked with old pain. "But I underestimated the cost of abandoning those I loved." Torretti thought of 30 years of mourning, of the guilt that had shaped every decision since Giuseppe's supposed death. "Why reveal yourself now?" "Because Santelli's ultimatum changes everything." Giuseppe moved closer, his face etched with urgency. "The same forces that drove me into exile are behind his blackmail campaign. They're using the abuse scandals as a weapon, Alessandro, not to achieve justice, but to install their own pope. You know about Santelli? I know about everything. The settlements, the cover-ups, the financial arrangements you've orchestrated to protect the church's reputation. But you don't understand the larger game." Giuseppe reached into his cassock and withdrew a manila folder. Sister Maria died protecting these documents, evidence that the abuse scandals were deliberately cultivated, that certain powerful men within the Vatican have been manufacturing crises to consolidate their control. Torretti's hands shook as he accepted the folder. Inside were photographs, financial records, correspondence that painted a picture of systemic corruption reaching far beyond anything Santelli had threatened to expose. "My God," he breathed. "Santelli isn't working alone," Giuseppe continued. "He's a front man for cardinals who want Francis removed so they can reshape the church according to their vision. The letter I supposedly left you. It was meant to be discovered now, when you needed hope, when you needed to believe your dead mentor approved of the compromises you've made. The implications crashed over Toretti like a tsunami. Everything he'd believed about Giuseppe's death, about his own moral choices, about the very nature of his service to the church, all of it had been orchestrated by men who saw faith as a commodity to be manipulated. "What do they want?" he asked. Giuseppe's eyes held infinite sadness. "They want you to convince Francis to resign. And if the letter fails to provide sufficient motivation, they have other weapons at their disposal." "What weapons?" "Evidence that you've been systematically covering up abuse cases for decades. Evidence that positions you as the architect of the church's moral failures." Giuseppe's voice dropped to a whisper. "Evidence that would destroy you completely while painting them as reformers cleaning house." Toretti staggered under the weight of revelation. He wasn't just caught between loyalty and truth. He was trapped in a web that had been 30 years in the weaving, a pawn in a game whose rules he was only beginning to understand. And somewhere in the shadows of Vatican City, the puppet masters were watching, waiting to see if their carefully constructed trap would finally claim its prize. The silence that followed Giuseppe's revelations stretched between them like a chasm. Toretti clutched the folder against his chest, feeling the weight of decades condensing into this single moment. In the ghostly light of the Sistine Chapel, surrounded by Michelangelo's witnessing angels, he finally understood the magnitude of his blindness. 30 years, he whispered. "You've been alive for 30 years, while his voice broke, while I carried your death like a stone in my chest." Giuseppe's face crumpled with genuine anguish. "Alessandro, if there had been any other way—" "Any other way?" Toretti's grief transformed into something sharper, more dangerous. "Do you know what I became without you? What your death turned me into?" He thought of the first settlement check he'd authorized, 6 months after Giuseppe's funeral. A young man from Naples whose priest had stolen more than innocence, whose family needed money more than justice. Toretti had told himself it was mercy, but Giuseppe's absence had made the choice easier. No mentor to disappoint, no moral authority to question the expediency. "The Benedetti case," Toretti said, the name emerging like a confession. 1995, a 14-year-old boy and father, Romano. "I buried it, Giuseppe, paid the family 200,000 lire and transferred Romano to a parish school." His voice grew hollow. "I told myself you would have understood the necessity." Giuseppe's face went ashen. "Alessandro." "The Rossi family in Milan. 3 children, spanning 5 years of abuse. I made it disappear because the diocese couldn't survive the scandal." Toretti's laugh held no humor. "I actually knelt at your supposed grave afterward, seeking your blessing for the compromise." The folder trembled in his hands as memories cascaded like an avalanche. Each settlement, each transfer, each decision to prioritize institutional survival over individual justice. He'd become an architect of silence, building monuments to expedience on foundations of others' suffering. "How many, Giuseppe? How many victims suffered because I thought you were dead? Because I believed your suicide proved that some secrets were too dangerous for the light?" Giuseppe reached toward him, but Toretti stepped back, the gesture feeling like violation. "You don't understand," Giuseppe pleaded. "The forces that drove me into hiding, they've been manipulating everything. The cases you handled, the settlements you authorized, many were manufactured crises designed to compromise you." "Manufactured?" The word tasted like ashes. "Those children were real, Giuseppe. Their pain was real. Whether the crisis was orchestrated or not, I chose silence over justice. I chose the church's reputation over their healing." Giuseppe's shoulders sagged. "I know. God help us both. I know what my absence cost. But, Alessandro, if you'd known the truth, if you'd understood that refusing these settlements might have triggered a coordinated attack on the papacy itself, would you have chosen differently?" The question hung between them like an accusation. Toretti thought of Pope John Paul II, struggling with Parkinson's while critics questioned his fitness for office, of the conservative cardinals who'd circled like vultures, waiting for weakness they could exploit. Would he have sacrificed children to protect the chair of Peter? "I don't know," he admitted, the words feeling like spiritual death. and that terrifies me more than any conspiracy." Giuseppe moved closer, his voice urgent. "The men behind Santelli's ultimatum are counting on that uncertainty. They've spent 30 years positioning you as their unwitting accomplice, creating a paper trail that makes you appear culpable while they remain hidden." Torretti opened the folder with trembling hands. The first document was a bank transfer record, his signature authorizing payment to the Benedetti family, but the amount listed was 10 times what he'd approved. Someone had been laundering money through victim settlements, using the church's legitimate attempts at restitution to hide massive financial crimes. "They've been altering the records," he breathed, "for decades. Every settlement you authorized, every transfer you approved, they've been modified to suggest systematic corruption rather than individual crisis management." Giuseppe's voice carried the weight of terrible knowledge. They needed a scapegoat with enough authority to be credible but insufficient power to defend himself. The second document made Torretti's blood freeze, a memo bearing his forged signature, authorizing the recruitment and protection of priests with flexible moral standards for sensitive pastoral assignments. The language was clinical, bureaucratic, and utterly damning. "This is monstrous," he whispered. "They're making me appear to be not just covering up abuse, but actively facilitating it." "Bishop Santelli will present these documents to the press if Francis refuses to resign," Giuseppe said. "The narrative will be simple. A corrupt Secretary of State finally exposed, and reformist cardinals cleaning house. Francis will fall, you'll be destroyed, and they'll install a pope who shares their vision of church authority." Torretti thought of the Holy Father, probably sleeping peacefully in his modest quarters, unaware that his papacy hung by such slender threads. Francis had trusted him completely, relied on his counsel in matters both spiritual and temporal. How could he explain that this trust had been built on foundations of sand? "What did we lose, Giuseppe?" The question emerged as barely a whisper. "Not just the victims we failed, but ourselves. What did 30 years of lies cost our souls?" Giuseppe's answer came laden with infinite regret, everything that mattered, and perhaps more than we can ever reclaim. The words hung between them like a funeral shroud, but Torretti felt something else stirring beneath the grief, a terrible clarity that cut through decades of carefully constructed justifications. He stared at the forged documents, at Giuseppe's weathered face, at the sacred frescoes bearing witness to their reunion, and realized he'd been asking the wrong questions. "You said they needed a scapegoat," Torretti said slowly. "Someone with authority but no real power to defend himself." Giuseppe nodded, his expression grave. "The perfect fall guy." "No." Torretti's voice carried a new edge. "You're wrong about the power." He closed the folder deliberately, his movements precise despite the tremor in his hands. "I had all the power, Giuseppe, every single case that crossed my desk. I could have chosen differently. I could have demanded investigations instead of authorizing payments. I could have insisted on transparency instead of silence. Alessandro, you don't understand the pressures." "I understand perfectly." The revelation crystallized with brutal clarity. "You think I was manipulated into making those choices, that I'm some innocent victim of a 30-year conspiracy, but that's not what happened, is it?" Giuseppe's face went pale. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I wasn't their scapegoat. I was their willing accomplice." Torretti's laugh held no warmth. "They didn't have to forge my moral compromises, Giuseppe. I made them freely, eagerly. The only thing they had to manufacture was evidence that I'd profited from the corruption." The truth hit him like a physical blow. All these years he'd told himself he was protecting the church, serving the greater good, making necessary sacrifices. But standing here with the man whose death had shaped every rationalization, Torretti saw his choices with unforgiving clarity. "The Benedetti boy," he continued, his voice growing stronger. "I didn't pay his family because someone forced my hand. I paid them because writing a check was easier than facing what Father Romano had done. Because a quiet settlement protected my career better than a public trial." Giuseppe stepped forward, alarm replacing confusion. "Alessandro, you're being too harsh." "Am I?" "When the Rossi family threatened to go to the newspapers, do you know what my first thought was? Not horror at what those children had endured. It was panic about how the scandal would affect my position as Secretary of State." Toretti's hands clenched into fists. I turned their suffering into a career problem to be managed. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the distant chiming of Vatican clocks marking the hour. Giuseppe's face had gone ashen, as if he were seeing his former protege clearly for the first time. "You want to know what 30 years of lies cost our souls?" Toretti asked. "It cost me the ability to distinguish between protecting the church and protecting myself. Every settlement I authorized, every transfer I approved, I told myself it was for the greater good. But the truth is simpler and more damning." He moved toward the altar, his footsteps echoing in the sacred space. I was protecting Alessandro Toretti. My reputation, my position, my comfortable certainty that I was one of the good men making hard choices. The victims were just acceptable casualties in that protection. Giuseppe followed, his voice desperate. "The conspiracy is real, Alessandro. They did manipulate." "Of course they manipulated me. But manipulation only works when you want to be manipulated." Toretti turned to face his mentor, feeling decades of self-deception crumble away. "They offered me exactly what I craved, moral cover for immoral choices, and I took it gratefully." The weight of this recognition should have crushed him, but instead Toretti felt something unexpected: relief. For 30 years he'd carried the burden of believing he was a good man making necessary compromises. The truth was infinitely darker, but somehow cleaner. "Bishop Santelli," he said suddenly. "Where is he now?" Giuseppe blinked at the apparent non sequitur. What?" "You said he's working for the cardinals who want Francis removed, that he's their front man in this conspiracy." Toretti's voice carried new purpose. "But that's not quite right, is it? You're still thinking like they want you to think." Understanding dawned in Giuseppe's eyes, followed quickly by fear. "Alessandro, no. Santelli isn't their puppet," Toretti continued. "He's their target. They're using my guilt to manipulate Francis into resignation, but they're also positioning Santelli to take the blame when the whole operation is exposed. Another scapegoat, another fall guy who thought he was playing a bigger game." Giuseppe's silence confirmed what Toretti had already realized. The conspiracy was even more elegant than he'd imagined, not just a plot to remove Francis, but a systematic elimination of threats to some deeper power structure within the Vatican. "You know who's really behind this," Toretti said. It wasn't a question. Giuseppe's answer came as barely a whisper: "Yes. God forgive me, I've always known." And in that moment, Toretti understood that his mentor's 30-year exile hadn't been escape at all. It had been recruitment. The air between them seemed to crystallize, charged with the weight of Giuseppe's admission. Toretti stared at the man he'd mourned for 3 decades, seeing for the first time not the martyred idealist of his memories, but something far more complex and infinitely more dangerous. "Recruitment," Toretti repeated. The word, tasting like communion wine, turned to vinegar. "They didn't silence you. They enlisted you." Giuseppe's weathered hands trembled as he reached for the chapel's marble rail, seeking support. "It wasn't supposed to happen this way. When they offered me exile instead of death, I thought—" "You thought you could play their game better than they could play it." Toretti's voice carried a deadly calm. "How long, Giuseppe? How long have you been feeding them information about Vatican operations? About papal appointments? About me?" The silence stretched between them like a blade. Outside, the first bells of morning prayer began their ancient call, but here in the Sistine Chapel, surrounded by images of divine judgment, only human betrayal held court. "Every major decision of your tenure as Secretary of State," Giuseppe finally whispered, "every financial arrangement, every diplomatic initiative, every private conversation with Francis, they've known about all of it." Toretti felt something crack inside his chest, not his heart breaking, but something harder and more fundamental. The last vestiges of the man who had believed in moral complexity, who had told himself that good intentions could sanctify corrupt means. "The Santelli dossier," he said with crystalline clarity. "You helped them assemble it." Giuseppe's face crumpled. "They said it would never be used, that it was merely insurance, a way to ensure Vatican cooperation with broader reforms." "Reforms?" Toretti's laugh echoed off the ancient walls. "What reforms require the systematic destruction of a papacy? What improvements demand the orchestrated humiliation of the Church itself?" He began walking toward Giuseppe, his footsteps measured and deliberate. You want to know what I see when I look at you now? Not my beloved mentor. Not even a fallen priest. I see 30 years of my own choices reflected back at me. Every rationalization I made, every compromise I justified, every time I told myself that serving the greater good required betraying the immediate good. Giuseppe pressed himself against the marble rail. Alessandro, please. But there's one crucial difference between us, Torretti continued, closing the distance. I betrayed my principles while believing I was upholding them. You betrayed yours knowing exactly what you were doing. The accusation hung between them, but Giuseppe's response surprised him. Instead of denial or further justification, the old priest straightened, and for a moment Torretti glimpsed the man he remembered, brilliant, uncompromising, utterly certain of his moral authority. Yes, Giuseppe said simply, I knew exactly what I was doing, and I did it to save the church from men like you. The words hit Torretti like a physical blow. Men like me? Do you think your corruption existed in isolation? That you were the only Secretary of State making deals with devils? Giuseppe's voice gained strength, the voice that had once commanded lecture halls and shaped young minds. The network I serve has been documenting Vatican rot for decades. Cardinals who sell appointments to the highest bidder, bishops who trade canonical favors for political support, a papal bureaucracy so thoroughly compromised that reform from within became impossible. Torretti stared at his mentor, understanding dawning like a cold sunrise. You're not working for conservatives who want Francis removed. You're working for revolutionaries who want the entire Vatican structure destroyed. Purified, Giuseppe corrected. Returned to its apostolic foundations. Francis is a good man, but he's trying to reform an institution that's beyond reformation. The rot runs too deep. The compromise is too extensive. Sometimes amputation is the only cure for gangrene. And Santelli? A useful idealist who believes he's defending traditional Catholic values against progressive heresy. He has no idea that his blackmail campaign serves much larger purposes. Giuseppe's smile held no warmth. When the dust settles, both he and Francis will be gone. The conservative cardinals who think they're orchestrating this coup will find themselves the next targets for exposure. Torretti felt the final pieces of the puzzle clicking into place with terrible clarity, a complete house cleaning. You're planning to destroy the existing power structure entirely. We're planning to save the church by burning away the accumulated lies of centuries. Giuseppe stepped closer, his eyes blazing with fanatic certainty, including the lies men like you have spent your careers constructing. The moment crystallized around them, mentor and student, betrayer and betrayed, facing each other across a chasm 30 years in the making. Torretti understood now that every choice he'd made, every compromise he'd authorized, had been observed, documented, and weaponized by the man he'd trusted above all others. But he also understood something else, something that transformed his despair into something harder and more dangerous. Giuseppe's revolution depended on Torretti remaining the man he'd always been, guilty, compromised, paralyzed by his own moral failures. That man had died somewhere between the forged documents and this final revelation. What remained was something his mentor hadn't anticipated and couldn't control. Climax. Torretti moved with deliberate calm toward the altar, his footsteps echoing in the sacred silence. Giuseppe watched him warily, perhaps sensing the transformation that had occurred in his former student. You miscalculated, Torretti said, his voice carrying a new authority that seemed to emanate from the very walls of the Sistine Chapel. Your revolution assumes that broken men stay broken, that guilt is a permanent condition, that shame is an unbreakable chain. He turned to face Giuseppe directly, and in that moment the dynamic between them shifted irrevocably. No longer mentor and student, no longer even betrayer and betrayed. Now they stood as equals in their fallen humanity, but with vastly different choices stretching before them. I was indeed the man you describe, Torretti continued. Corrupt, compromised, more concerned with protecting my position than serving justice. Every settlement I authorized, every silence I purchased, I told myself it was for the church, but we both know it was for Alessandro Torretti. Giuseppe's eyes narrowed. Then you understand why. I understand that you've made the same mistake I made for 30 years. Toretti's interruption carried the weight of absolute certainty. You've confused the church with the men who currently lead it. You've decided that because the institution is wounded, it must be destroyed. He moved closer, his presence filling the space between them. But here's what you didn't anticipate, Giuseppe. Sometimes broken men find grace. Sometimes shame becomes the foundation for true repentance. Sometimes the very corruption you've documented so carefully becomes the catalyst for genuine transformation. Giuseppe's face went pale. It's too late for transformation. The corruption runs too deep. Does it? Toretti reached into his cassock and withdrew his phone, its screen glowing in the candlelit darkness. Because I have something your revolutionaries didn't count on. Giuseppe stepped backward, alarm replacing confidence. Alessandro, what are you doing? I'm calling Bishop Santelli. Toretti's fingers moved across the screen with steady precision. I'm going to tell him exactly what you told me. About the network you serve, about the plans to destroy both him and Francis, about the true scope of this conspiracy. You can't. Giuseppe lunged forward, but Toretti's voice stopped him cold. Can't I? You said it yourself. I've been your willing accomplice for decades. That makes me uniquely qualified to expose this operation from the inside. The phone began dialing. Santelli thinks he's defending traditional values. When he learns he's actually serving revolutionaries who want to burn the church to the ground, what do you think will happen to his enthusiasm for blackmail? Giuseppe's face contorted with desperate calculation. They'll destroy you anyway. The forged documents, the manufactured evidence. Let them try. Toretti's smile held no warmth but infinite resolve. I spent 30 years running from the truth about myself. I won't spend whatever time remains running from the truth about this conspiracy. The phone continued ringing. Giuseppe made one final plea. Alessandro, you don't understand the forces involved. These aren't just disgruntled cardinals or ambitious bishops. The network I serve has connections throughout the Vatican, in governments and financial institutions. They can do whatever they want to Alessandro Toretti. Toretti interrupted. But they cannot touch the truth once it's spoken. And they cannot prevent Francis from defending his papacy once he knows what he's really fighting. The call connected. Bishop Santelli? This is Cardinal Toretti. We need to speak immediately. It's about your ultimatum to the Holy Father, and about the people who have been manipulating us both. Giuseppe's shoulders sagged in defeat, but his eyes held something else, a flicker of what might have been respect or perhaps recognition. For a moment, Toretti glimpsed the teacher he had once known, the priest who had shaped his early understanding of moral courage. You realize this destroys you as well, Giuseppe said quietly. Whatever redemption you're seeking, it won't erase the damage you've done. No, Toretti agreed, holding the phone as Santelli's shocked voice demanded explanations, but it might prevent further damage. And sometimes, Giuseppe, that's the only grace available to broken men. As he began explaining the truth to an increasingly stunned Bishop Santelli, Toretti felt the weight of 30 years beginning to lift. Not the guilt, that would remain, a permanent reminder of the cost of moral compromise, but the paralysis, the crushing certainty that his failures defined his future as completely as they had shaped his past. Giuseppe watched in silence as his carefully constructed revolution began crumbling with each word Toretti spoke. The mentor who had orchestrated decades of manipulation found himself confronted by something he had never anticipated, the possibility that redemption could be chosen rather than granted, that broken men could break their own chains. In the Sistine Chapel, beneath Michelangelo's vision of divine judgment, human choice reclaimed its terrible and magnificent power. The climax had arrived not with violence or chaos, but with the quiet dignity of a man choosing truth over survival, service over self-preservation, and hope over the comfortable certainty of despair. Resolution. 3 weeks after Holy Week ended, Cardinal Alessandro Toretti sat in the same Vatican garden where this crisis had begun. But the man occupying the stone bench bore little resemblance to the Secretary of State who had first received Bishop Santelli's ultimatum. The morning light fell differently now. softer somehow, as if the very air had been cleansed by truth. Bishop Santelli had proven surprisingly resilient when confronted with the scope of his manipulation. The ambitious prelate's rage at being used as a pawn had transformed quickly into cooperation, his dossier of scandals becoming evidence not against Pope Francis, but against the network that had assembled it. Within hours of Toretti's phone call, Santelli had provided names, dates, and financial records that traced the conspiracy's reach far beyond Vatican walls. Giuseppe Mora had vanished that same night, but his decades of meticulous record-keeping remained behind, a treasure trove of documentation that revealed the true scope of the revolutionary network. The man who had planned to burn down the church to save it had instead provided the very evidence needed to preserve it. Pope Francis had listened to Toretti's full confession with the patience that had made him beloved by millions. When the cardinal finished speaking about the cover-ups, the payments, the 30 years of moral compromise, the Holy Father had been silent for a long time. Finally, he had spoken words that would echo in Toretti's memory until his death. Alessandro, the church has always been built on broken men. The question is not whether we fall, but whether we choose to rise. The formal investigation had moved with surprising swiftness. 3 cardinals, 2 Vatican bank officials, and a dozen lesser prelates had been quietly removed from their positions. The financial settlements Toretti had authorized were being reviewed, with victims' families receiving not just larger compensation, but direct access to mental health services and canonical justice processes. Toretti's own fate had been decided in a private meeting with Francis just 3 days ago. His resignation as Secretary of State would be announced next week, along with his appointment to a small parish in rural Sicily, the same region where he had been born 74 years ago. It was, Francis had said with a slight smile, a chance for both of us to remember what shepherding actually means. The irony was not lost on Toretti. Giuseppe's revolution had failed, but it had achieved something its architect never intended: genuine reform. The church would emerge from this crisis smaller but cleaner, wounded but honest about its wounds. The network of manipulation and blackmail that had operated in shadows for decades now faced the harsh light of Vatican investigation and eventually canonical justice. Bishop Santelli would face his own reckoning, but privately rather than publicly. His dossier of scandals, while real, had been assembled through illegal means and tainted by conspiracy. Francis had chosen mercy over justice, accepting Santelli's resignation and exile, rather than pursuing formal charges. Even pawns deserve the chance to become something else, the Pope had explained. A soft footstep on the garden path interrupted Toretti's reflections. He looked up to see a young priest approaching, Father Miguel Santos, recently appointed as his interim replacement. The man's nervous energy reminded Toretti painfully of his own younger self, so certain that good intentions could justify any means. Cardinal Toretti? Father Santos's voice carried the deference due to rank, but also genuine concern. The Holy Father asked me to give you this. He extended a sealed envelope bearing the papal seal. Toretti accepted it with steady hands, noting how the young priest watched his face for any sign of distress. How different this moment felt from that terrible morning when he had first opened Giuseppe's letter, the forgery that had started his world collapsing. Inside the envelope was a single sheet of papal stationery, bearing words written in Francis's distinctive script. Alessandro, you asked me once what grace looks like for men like us. I think it looks like choosing truth when lies would be safer, service when self-preservation would be smarter, hope when despair would be easier. You have shown me what grace looks like. Now go show others. Francis. Toretti folded the letter carefully and slipped it into his cassock, next to his heart. When he looked up, Father Santos was still watching him with poorly concealed curiosity. Father, Toretti said gently, might I offer you some advice? The young priest nodded eagerly. The church will ask you to make compromises. Some will be necessary, some will be tempting, and some will be evil disguised as necessity. Toretti stood slowly, feeling his age in his joints but not in his spirit. The hardest part is learning to tell the difference. The second hardest part is accepting that sometimes the most faithful choice is also the most costly one. He began walking toward the apostolic palace, then paused. And Father, When you inevitably fail, because we all fail, remember that failure is not the end of the story. Sometimes it's the beginning of grace. As Toretti walked away, he felt the morning sun warm his face. In 3 weeks, he would leave Vatican City for a small church in Sicily where no one knew his name or his failures. He would spend whatever years remained learning to be the priest he should have been 30 years ago. Behind him, Father Santos stood alone in the garden, clutching his new responsibilities and wondering if he possessed the wisdom to avoid the traps that had ensnared his predecessor. The cycle would continue. Imperfect men serving a perfect calling, failing and rising and failing again. But perhaps that was exactly as it should be.